The Camden Town murder pictures remain controversial, and they've lent weight to the fantasy that Sickert wielded both palette knife and killer's blade.
When he was walking home one evening from a musical, and he recounted how some girls who were in the street saw him coming along and ran away from him shouting, "It's Jack the Ripper, it's Jack the Ripper."
It wasn't until after his death that Sickert was accused of the murder of 11 prostitutes in the grim Victorian slums of Whitechapel. Matthew Sturgis pored over the case, based mostly on the sinister mood of Sickert's pictures, when writing his biography of the artist.
Most recently, we've had the book of Patricia Cornwall, who convinced herself from staring very hard at some of Sickert's pictures that he was a crazed, woman-hating psychopath. But for much of that late summer of 1888, he was away, not just in Dieppe in France, but along the coast from Dieppe in Normandy at Saint-Valery-en-Caux. He can be pinpointed to that little seaside town on the night before one of the murders. So it is just inconceivable, really, that he could have had anything to do with them. He spent his life assuming different guises and playing different roles, and he would be very amused and delighted, I suppose, to find that he'd been cast in such a glamorous part as Jack the Ripper.
In 1910, an exhibition of continental works in London pointed towards a different course for modern art. Roger Fry's Manet and the Post-Impressionists exhibition. Britain was rocked by the art quake of 1910, as it came to be known. Everyone, that is, except for Sickert. Sickert was unmoved by the furore. He already knew all about the Post-Impressionists, and he was distinctly un-post-impressed. He wrote a scathing review of the exhibition in which he had a go at Van Gogh. He simply quoted Voltaire on the nature of madness. Matisse, he said, was guilty of all the worst art school tricks. And Picasso, little did he know, Picasso, Sickert said, is a quite accomplished sort of minor international painter. Now, why did the exhibition get Sickert's goat in the way that it did? Up until now, he'd been a follower, a supporter of the new, unlike most of his English contemporaries. But I think at this point, he decided to draw a line in the sand. He could see that where these painters were taking modern art was away into abstraction, into pure form, into pure imagination. He felt there was a danger that painting could lose touch with the only things that really mattered to him: human life, human stories. But Fry's exhibition did prove that modern art was evolving at an ever-increasing pace. And Sickert was pragmatic. If there were to be changes, best to have a say in them. With Harold Gilman and Spencer Gore, a new exhibiting society was set up, the Camden Town Group. And in June 1911, they held their first exhibition. The style? Modern, but not modernist. 1911 was certainly a busy year. One woman rejected his proposal of marriage, another jilted him at the altar in favour of a younger man, and then he reverted, quite justifiably, as he said, to a previous engagement. He wired friends. Marry Saturday, a certain Christine Angus. Jeweller would not take wedding ring back. Christine had been a pupil at the art classes Sickert gave at his home in Camden. He was 51. She was 17 years his junior. He announced that she looked just like a pelican, a compliment, apparently. The artist's new happiness didn't alter his essentially melancholic view of modern life. He developed a new kind of suspended domestic narrative. A faceless man lurches off to the pub, leaving behind a disconsolate wife. Figures in doom-laden interiors, suffocated by fetid air. Sickert's titles are often decoys or diversions or tricks played on the audience, but in the case of this picture, I think he really meant the title. He called it Ennui, which is not quite the same in French as its English translation, boredom. In French, ennui implies disgust, a kind of weariness with life, and that is what this picture seems to be all about. It shows us two figures in an interior, and although they're right next to each other, they seem to be miles apart. The man, slumped in his chair, wearing a suit that's seen better days, puffing at his cigar. He's got glassy eyes. He seems entirely cut off from the reality around him, whereas the woman, slumped on the dresser, she stares at the wall, almost like a wounded animal. Everything in the scene seems charged with bitter meaning. The glass, perhaps, of gin, the booze on the shelf, but most telling of all, perhaps, is this hangover from late Victorian taste, some stuffed birds under a bell jar. This room, to me, feels like a kind of bell jar, an airless space in which two sad individuals are living out desiccated lives. In 1914, Sickert resigned from what had been the Camden Town Group, appalled by the inclusion of modernist artists. Feeling alienated and angry, he returned to France. He purchased a house in Anvermont, near his old haunt of Dieppe. In this idyllic location, the artist started another of his private battles. He painted this obelisk, with the rising plain behind, attempting to conquer the scene's complex perspective. As the great powers moved inexorably towards the Great War, Sickert turned his face away from the conflict. He knew he wouldn't be enlisted for fighting, and he came to this quiet corner of Normandy, not far from Dieppe, where he set about painting a weather-worn memorial to a long-forgotten conflict, a battle fought by Henry IV of France back in 1589. And when, on the 3rd of August 1914, Germany did finally declare war on France, what was Sickert's response? He simply turned back to his painting and said, "I can only fight one war at a time." The perspective Sickert wrestled with was moral, not merely spatial. The vainglory of kings set against the slow rhythms of nature, growth and harvest. The subtlest of anti-war pictures, a comment on the absurdity of a monument. Immediately after the outbreak of war, the Sickerts moved to a less remote location, a hotel in Dieppe. Sickert reported with amusement that he'd seen Lady Blanche Hosier camped out in an armchair by the port, watching the British flee back home on steamers. "C'est la mère de Churchill," the locals whispered. "It's the mother of Churchill." Dieppe braced itself. In 1914, Sickert was also left distraught by the death of his first wife, Ellen. She bequeathed him nothing, having quietly bought his pictures all her life. Yet despite private and public tumult, his creative life had never been better. "I suppose an eye for drawing is an eye for shooting," he wrote. When a German plane flew overhead, Sickert knew it was time to clear out, back to London. The artist's early war pictures are monumental in scale, deliberate fragments of the theatre of war. The soldiers of King Albert the Ready take aim, rifles cut off by Sickert's cropping. Modern warfare is mechanised, the enemy faceless, the killing happening elsewhere, out of sight. Sickert, however, sees the consequences. His favourite motif, the iron bedstead, put to a different use. A nurse tucking up a wounded soldier. Even Sickert's domestic interiors become charged with a new meaning. Girl playing a grand piano, soldier straining to hear her tune. Tipperary. The title changes everything. The song on every soldier's lips as they marched off to war, and then later at the front, yearning for home. But there's not much flag waving going on. Just a dreadful stillness. During World War I, unable to travel to his beloved Dieppe, Sickert holidayed in Brighton. In the summer of 1915, Brighton was out of kilter, out of joint. A holiday town, but it didn't feel like it. There were no young men on the streets. Brighton Pavilion was being used as a temporary hospital for injured Indian soldiers. And on a clear day, you could actually hear the bombardments going on the other side of the channel. There was an ominous mood about the town, and Sickert was the man to capture it. Sickert visited the open-air theatre on the beach every night for 5 weeks, sketching the Pierrot Theatre. Unlike the music hall, there was nothing risque about the show. This was wholesome family entertainment that, it was hoped, would drown out the cacophony of war. If I had to prove to someone who'd never heard of him that Walter Sickert was one of the great painters of the 20th century, and if I were allowed only one painting, this is the picture I'd choose. I think it's his masterpiece. Brighton Pierrots, 1915. Sickert self-deprecatingly described it as a bit of all right. And I think it's more than that. A theatrical performance taking place outside, under artificial light, in Brighton in the early evening. Here's the stage, there's a line of Brighton houses. And behind it all, this vast bruise of a sky that also looks like a conflagration. And I think it's Sickert's way of reminding us that, yes, war is taking place beyond this scene. Two performers. They look like automata, robots going through the motions of their turn. Look at the way in which also this one, he's had his face and his arms removed by the pictorial cropping of Sickert's composition. A mirror image of the real disfigurements and real dismemberments going on across the channel. The central figure of the painting, I think, look at the way the lines lead towards her, is this Pierrette, a faceless Pierrette in a pink polka dot dress playing the piano. Is she the mad organ grinder to whose tune everyone must dance? He'd always been a brilliant painter of the passing show, but this is the theatre of the absurd. In the immediate aftermath of World War I, Sickert resigned from his teaching posts. His position as an artist no longer certain, he, together with Christine, moved back to their home in Anvermont. By 1919, the artist was 59 years old. He saw this as his final move. The new serenity of Sickert's life was reflected in his art. He painted a series of still lives, simple produce. After the slaughter of World War I, he turned to the nourishment that sustains life. Shortly after moving into the Maison Mouton,